Hello learners, today we are going to do a poem written by W.H. Auden. It's titled In Memory of W.B. Yeats. William Butler Yeats was a famous Irish poet and dramatist. He died in 1939. Before we attempt a detailed analysis of the poem, let's first try to examine elegy as a poetic form. We have a long history of elegiac poetry. An elegy is a poem written in memory of a person on the occasion of his death. We have several different forms of elegy. An elegy could be written about a specific person, as in the case of Walt Whitman's poem, When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed. Or it could be a very general poem mourning the death of people, as in Thomas Gray's poem, Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard. We have another very popular form of elegy which is called the pastoral elegy. A few of the famous pastoral elegies are Milton's Lycidas, written on the death of Edward King, and Shelley's Auden, written on the death of his friend and famous poet John Keats. An elegy, while it is about a person's death, need not necessarily be very depressing. It could be about what is left behind after a person dies. And that is what we find even in Auden's poem. Traditionally, an elegy has three stages. The first stage deals with an expression of grief or sorrow on the loss of someone dear to the poet. The second stage deals with the praise of the person who is dead. The third stage is all about consolation and solace. Auden draws upon this traditional form and pattern. However, he does not stick to it very strictly. We do not find Auden praising Yeats or only dealing with the loss or grief at Yeats' death. We find that he deals with several themes. He talks about poetry in general and the value of poetry. He talks about the role of the poet. He also deals with the themes of temporality, war, and delusion. Auden urges us not to be the unknown citizen who is passive, but he wants the reader to be somebody who has a concern for what is happening in the world around him, to respond sensitively to death or war or whatever may be that happens. And he also urges the reader to face situations bravely and rejoice in the face of fear. The poem is interesting because it has a universality and relevance. W.H. Auden's full name is Wystan Hugh Auden. He was born in 1907 and died in 1973. He was one of the most active of young English poets who in the late 1920s and 30s chose to write about several contemporary issues and brought in new attitudes and techniques to English poetry. The Great Depression that hit America in 1929 came to England soon after. Auden and his contemporaries saw not a metaphorical wasteland of Eliot, but a more literal wasteland of mass unemployment, poverty, and industrial stagnation. Nobel Prize winner W.B. Yeats was one of the founders of Irish literary revival, and his works draw heavily on Irish mythology and history. A devoted patriot, Yeats found his voice to speak out against the harsh nationalist policies of the time. His works explore the greater themes of life in contrast to art and finding beauty in the mundane. When Auden wrote in memory of W.B. Yeats, the world was on the verge of breaking into war. The Second World War was about to occur, though of course it had not broken out yet. The failure of Britain and France to resist Hitler's claims on Czechoslovakia in 1938 seemed to define the mood of Europe, as Auden wrote. In spite of the sense of expectant foreboding, all the nations seemed paralyzed, incapable of action. Auden's poem breaks the mold of traditional elegies. He chooses not to lament Yeats' death. He also does not simply praise Yeats. He, in fact, chooses even to criticize Yeats. He chose to traverse the vast expanse of Yeats' work and life. We find a sense of urgency in this poem, perhaps because the Second World War is imminent. There is almost something prophetic about Auden's observation of life and people. People, too locked in their own routine lives, did not seem to care about the pain and suffering of their fellow beings. This is something Auden wants us, the readers, to think about. Auden denies the political consequence of poetry, and he suggests that poetry can effectively portray the world and connect the people who share a common suffering and common emotions. Auden's poem points out that Yeats' work did not gain prominence because of his political ambitions or because he wanted to change Ireland through his poetry, but because of the reader's response to his poetry and because of the poetic excellence in his works. The first line of the poem, "He disappeared in the dead of winter," brings a very strong and clear image of Yeats walking out into the darkness of winter, all alone. Auden chooses to use successive images to build up this concept of desolation. Not only nature, but the cold mechanical works of man fail to record the event of death in any amount of accuracy. The reader is thrust step by step into the cold shock of the described day. Auden expresses doubts about the adequacy of human tools in recording death. If recording the death of a body is difficult, we can imagine how much more difficult it would be to in any way measure the impact of the life of the mind and the soul. Auden deliberately chooses to refer to Yeats as the poet, making him an anonymous figure rather than a specific man. Even the mourners are abstracted into mourning tongues rather than specific persons. Auden emphasizes Yeats' humanness by taking a glimpse into the world of hospitals and nurses, things that we do not normally think about when we are mourning the loss or the death of a national figure. The provinces of his body revolted, the squares of his mind were empty, silence invaded the suburbs. Auden turns to geographic and architectural language to describe human conditions. Yeats' body is described as a city at war with itself, a war that it eventually loses. In death, even Yeats' poems change. They can no longer be mouthed by the poet himself. Rather, the words of his poems get modified in the guts of the living. The human world goes on as usual. We wonder whether Yeats' death would outlive the evening news. The concluding lines of the first stanza are repeated as the final lines of the first section. This repetition underscores the fact that we do not have adequate tools to measure the impact of that strange, mysterious, complicated thing called death. In the second section, the speaker directs his words to a you, perhaps Yeats himself. Instead of speaking about what is good and honorable about the dead poet Yeats, the speaker talks about how Yeats' gift emerged perhaps not in spite of, but because of the complexities of his personality. Auden says, "Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry. Now Ireland has her madness and her weather still, for poetry makes nothing happen." These lines show how deeply involved Yeats was in the Irish independent movement. Some of his most remembered poems, like Easter 1916, emerge from his engagement with the struggles for independence. Yeats loved his country and he wanted to cure his country through his poetry. However, Ireland continued to be sick. Yeats wanted to use poetry as a tool, and it is there that Auden differs from Yeats. He recognizes the fact that poetry cannot be used as a tool to change anyone, not the politics of a nation, not the psychology of an individual. He accepts that poetry is not static, it is dynamic. Auden clarifies that poetry is not a force in itself, but made dynamic by its interpreters and each one's foreign code of conscience. Poetry presents a world that's both real and far removed from our own, and it does so on its own terms. When you're done reading a poem, you're not left with anything tangible. It's more of what you experience. Poetry is an understanding of the sensibility of the poet and how it is reflected in the poet's words. It's a way of happening. Auden seems to insist on the mobility and vitality of poetry. Amidst all this freezing isolation of the world, poetry is one thing that can function as an active instrument, an instrument that can make us think and perhaps even change the world, but not directly, but more as a motivational force. In the third section of the poem, Auden for the first time refers to Yeats by name. Conventionally, an elegy explains right at the outset who it is that the poet is mourning. Auden reverses this practice here by mentioning it in the final section of the poem. Auden refers to Yeats here as an Irish vessel, perhaps a body that is meant just to carry his poetry, but there is no reference at all to the kind of problems that were referred to in the second section of the poem, not the problems of Irish politics, not the problems of Yeats the person. Auden also mentions the specifics of Yeats' death, especially the time of his death, that is 1939, the year when the world was gearing up for the Second World War. Yeats and Auden shared the sentiments of many of their contemporaries, fellow artists and intellectuals who were really troubled by the thought of impending war. The speaker refers to and paints the picture of impending war as a kind of nightmarish unreality. The third stanza of the section doesn't seem to have anything to do with Yeats. Auden perhaps wants the reader to remember Yeats the poet only through his poetry and not Yeats the man. We also sense here a subtle criticism of Yeats the man. The poet is a figure that lives on in his poetry and is not necessarily attached to the deeds of the man. Poetry is now channeled into a single image of a healing fountain. In the deserts of the heart, let the healing fountain start. The way Auden crafts these lines is an invocation of Yeats's poetic powers. The last lines of the poem sound depressing because life is described as a prison. However, there is hope because one can learn to praise. Auden's final approach to this elegy is thought-provoking and interesting. He doesn't want Yeats to be remembered forever, nor does he want Yeats' poetry to be immortalized. He only wants people to read and think about the poetry that Yeats wrote and perhaps try and become a better person by reading Yeats' poems. Let us now discuss some of the stylistic features and poetic devices employed in the poem. The poet uses several images of water, moving, flowing, churning things up. Water is a quintessential symbolic image of mobility and change. Water is described as a peasant river and a fashionable quay. We find here that water flows through the concrete jungles of the city amidst all the congestion and the confusion. Water images are also used to depict the negative. We find seas of pity frozen inside the hearts of people who do not respond to what is happening around them. Finally, poetry is also described as the healing fountain that can bring about a change in people's hearts. This poem being an elegy, we have several images of impending doom, disaster, death, and negativity. Nightmares and barking dogs and hitting the rock bottom are some of these images. Rhyme, form, and meter, these are the blueprints of any poem. We find that Auden uses here the traditional elegy form, rhyming couplets, as well as the free form. He perhaps wanted to pay a tribute to Yeats' poetic power. Because Yeats was a master of form, he played around with the Irish traditional limericks, and right up to the epic form, Yeats tried everything. In this poem, we also find one interesting feature, that is, the speaker is very close to the poet. In all poems, the speaker may not necessarily be identified with the poet. However, here the poet is more or less the speaker. The setting reflects the tone of the poem. The first section gives the actual setting of Yeats' death, that is a hospital and all the dismal things associated with the mundane aspects of death. However, the setting shifts to include Ireland and the entire landscape of Yeats' life. The setting expands also to include the world in 1939, when it was on the brink of the Second World War. The three settings of the poem cover the mundane details of life, even as it philosophizes on the state of the world and the value of poetry or art. Now that we have looked at the variations in form, metrical patterns, speaker, and setting, let us see how Auden conveys a mixture of urgency and hesitation. It's indeed a formidable task to chronicle the life and death of one of the most famous poets of his age. That tension gives the poem its sonic variance. Auden maintains a simple, restrained tone throughout the first section of the poem. Suddenly, the tone shifts and Auden addresses Yeats as though he were a dear friend. However, very soon the tone again shifts, perhaps as if the personal tone and the emotionality of it was too much for Auden. We find him revert to the traditional form of the elegy. The changes are lightning fast, and Auden packs in a lot of emotion here. Auden's language in this poem is incredibly sparse, as if he is determined to depict Yeats' life with a restraint that he himself does not feel. Discussing the themes of a poem can help one understand it better. A poem can have more than one theme. The theme of death is prominent in this poem, it being an elegy. However, death here becomes an occasion for the poet to reflect upon the complicated legacy that Yeats has left behind and the ways in which Yeats' work has colored the 20th century poetic landscape. Another major theme is the social validity of art or poetry. Auden maintains that while art or poetry does not have a value by itself and cannot really change anything, it has the capacity to make people think and bring about a change perhaps through that thought that could then be translated into action. The theme of isolation is also prominent in the poem. Auden suggests that while poetry is not a cure-all, it can certainly help people see the truth of their own situation and perhaps realize the facts of their own lonely existence and then do something about it. Unlike traditional elegies, the poem does not seek to praise the subject of the elegy. That is, Auden here does not praise Yeats. Instead, he chooses to pay homage to Yeats in a much more honest manner by showing him as he himself sees the dead poet. The poem certainly makes us realize that poetry is an experience. It's all about freedom and exposing yourself to new ways of looking at the world and people.